and welcome to Comic Boom, the Comics and Education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice, and hopefully shine some light on some titles you can bring into your libraries, your classrooms, and your bookshelves at home too. Today I am joined by Steve Marchant. Steve is a cartoonist and a comic artist who's worked for British Airways, the BBC, ITV, the British Council, and many other clients, big and small. He's also been running cartoon and comic strip workshops in schools and libraries across the UK since 1992. Now he does that primarily for the Cartoon Museum in London, where he is the learning coordinator and comic art consultant to the curator. Steve also runs adult evening courses in drawing for comics and graphic novels at City Lit, a university near Holborn. So many different things to talk about. Really interested to hear about the Cartoon Museum more, the exhibitions they have, the different initiatives that they run throughout the year. I think there's loads of things that could be built into people's practice across the year, moments of celebration, things to get the children and young people that we work with excited about creating their own comics and cartoons. So some really good practical takeouts from this episode, and Steve was really interesting to talk to. Here's what he had to say. Hello, Steve. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello, Lucy. Thank you for having me.
It's brilliant to have you here. Can we talk about you individually first? I know you're here as part of your role at the Cartoon Museum as well. We're going to hear a lot more about that later. But can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a comics reader? Where did that start for you?
Well, I've been reading comics, since before I could read, really. Comics fascinated me as a very small child. I don't know exactly why. I enjoyed picture books, and I think for me at a very early age, it was the idea that there was a whole sequence of pictures I could visually follow the story from. So, because at that age I couldn't read. So comics entranced me as a child, and my dad and my mum would feed that. And so, I read nursery comics, growing up. There was comics, with fairy tale characters and nursery rhyme characters. So that was probably when I was about 3 years old. And then eventually graduated towards, the Dandy, the Beano, Whizzer and Chips, all the usual suspects. And then one day my dad came in with an American Batman comic, and that just blew my tiny mind. And here I am.
That was a big moment.
Years later.
And did they form part of your school journey at all, or was it very much something that was at home?
Oh, in those days, it was very much at home. I did take comics to school to read at break time or to show my friends. But if I ever dared to take one out in the classroom, say if I'd finished my work and I thought, I'll just finish reading Spider-Man, it would be confiscated and given back to me at the end of the day with a letter to my mum saying, don't let Stephen bring these American horror comics into the school again. But I still did. And they weren't horror comics, but it was a very different time. And it was kind of ironic as well, because comics is what taught me to read. Because at that young age, I was getting comics and I couldn't read them. I was pestering my mum to read the stories to me all the time. And she got a bit fed up with it. So when I was 4, my mum used to sit me down at 1:30 after watch with mother. And for half an hour a day, she began to teach me the phonetic alphabet. And then she would teach me that, T and H makes th, and C and H makes ch, and that the magic E on the end of the word made the vowel say its name in the middle. And all these simple little rules. And then I would spend the rest of the afternoon staring at the speech bubbles in my comics, trying to sort of sound them out to myself. Which meant that when I started school at 5, I had a reading test, and I had a reading age of 14. So despite these evil, awful comics being so bad for me, they did mean that I had pretty much an adult reading level at the point I started school.
That's incredible. That's why you were finishing early, getting your comic out. So you were reading very much the kind of weekly editions of comics as a child. Is that something that you're still interested in at the moment? What does your reading diet look like now?
Well, it is a thing. for decades, I had a very healthy reading diet of comics. I had all the great stuff from Fantagraphics, Drawn and Quarterly, all those wonderful, worthy creators, as well as a smattering still of Marvel and DC and things like that. But in recent years, I found myself having to downsize quite considerably. So a lot of my collection for graphic novels and books about comics and comics themselves, I wound up donating to Staffordshire University.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, they have a graphic novel degree, and I've taught up there a couple of times. And the first time I went, I was dismayed at the state of their so-called library, which was really just 2 shelves of old dog-eared Star Trek and Buffy the Vampire Slayer graphic novels. And so I basically gave them 600 books.
Wow.
So now they've got all the good stuff. They've got Jack Kirby, Will Eisner. They've got a lot of foreign cartoonists that they can look at.
Well, that's amazing.
And perhaps it'll stop them all trying to draw bloody manga all the time.
And can you go and get your books out of the library as well if you ever fancy reading one of them?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I have, apparently they've named the library after me.
Amazing.
And anytime I want to read one of my books, I can just catch a train to Stoke-on-Trent. And they're all still there, So what that means, though, is that these days, I've gone back to buying the Beano, basically. The Beano, for your listeners who may have not read it for long years, a very clever comic. I got right back into it when DC Thompson, the publisher, used to send the Cartoon Museum free copies for us to put out in the classroom. And so I began reading it, and I realised it had changed a lot from when I was a little kid, where it was a pretty kind of anodyne read. Very clever writing. Almost like sitcom level script writing, so that the kids enjoy the knockabout antics, but there's stuff there for the parents as well. So it's like my weekly Wednesday treat now from the little newsagent stand in Brixton Tube Station. The guy knows I've come from my Beano, passes it to me. And and I still enjoy Viz. I mainly get it from my mum, who always asks for it when I go to visit. She's 86, and growing up she was one of the most prudish women you could ever wish to meet. But something's happened in old age.
Starting to loosen up a bit.
Likes a bit of toilet humor. Yeah.
So I know you're a cartoonist as well as being youth worker, tutor, having your role at the Cartoon Museum. You've had quite a varied career, all linked into different aspects of comics and education. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that kind of career path and how you got to be from this child reading Beano at break times to turning that into more of a job role.
When I was at college, there wasn't the kind of graphic novel degree courses that there are around the country now. I did a fairly wacky art course called Art and Design in Social Contexts, which was a 2-year diploma, but it was degree level, so I got a grant. I didn't have to pay any fees or anything. And that basically was to prepare artists for going and working in the community. And that's part of what we did on the course. And that's what I kind of left college and moved to London to attempt to do. But at that point, I wasn't really thinking of doing comic stuff with that. I mean, it just seemed to be something at the time I wanted to keep separate. So I became a youth worker, and I would just do general art workshops with, ne'er-do-well teenagers, and sometimes younger kids as well. And I was a youth worker for Lewisham Council in South London for 18 years.
Wow.
When I decided I was going to quit, my boss said, well, you've done all right because people do less time for murder, is what he said. But yeah, it was during that time that I started to get the idea that I could be doing comic workshops with kids, and that's kind of where it developed from. And I also was working at a school for cartoonists in the early 90s called the London Cartoon Centre, which was set up by David Lloyd of V for Vendetta fame. It was an adults cartooning school, basically, and I wound up assisting there, and then I wound up running the place. And that's when I first started to watch the tutors, who were all proper comic artists. I began to sit in on their sessions and not just sort of join in, but watch how they taught it. And it meant that I could pitch in if they were unavailable. And then from that's when I began developing my own cartoon workshops, visiting schools and libraries, colleges, right across, mainly around London, but actually right across Britain occasionally, and a few times in Europe. And that's also when I began working at the Cartoon Museum. And at first that was just freelance, just as and when required. But then it's become more of a role over the years. And for the last 6 years, I've been here full time as the learning coordinator and as pretty much the only tutor at the moment. So that's the long and winding road, Lucy, that brought me here.
That is fantastic. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the kinds of things that you're doing at the Cartoon Museum, but I think it'll be really useful. There's a lot of listeners outside of the UK for the podcast, but also just spread right across, so might not be familiar with what the Cartoon Museum is, where it is, and the kinds of things that it offers. Could you give us a little bit of an intro?
Yeah, sure. So the Cartoon Museum is in the heart of London, quite near to Oxford Circus Station, which is right in the middle of the main shopping district. And we're a building dedicated to showing original cartoon and comic strip art. We don't just cut pictures out of books and stick them up. We occasionally buy, if we've got any money, which doesn't happen often, or people donate artwork to us. And we have over 200 pages of original cartoon and comic art on display. We have one big gallery chronicling 300 years of British cartoon art, going right back to the days of artists like Hogarth and Gilray, right up to modern times, right up to just pre-COVID. And that's kind of a semi-permanent collection, although that is going to have a rejig later this year. Then we have another gallery alongside. That's our temporary exhibition gallery. And that's currently where we have artwork and props from Wallace and Gromit, which has proven to be one of the most popular exhibitions we've ever mounted.
That's brilliant.
It's been a real big hit for us. And so there's lots of the production art that went into a film called The Wrong Trousers, which is an hilarious film.
I remember it well. I feel like, when did that come out? The Wrong Trousers.
Came out 30 years ago.
I was about to say, I feel like it's from my childhood. So yeah.
That's what prompted Aardman Entertainment to contact us and say, would we host an exhibition to celebrate 30 years of that film?
That's fantastic.
Because it's the one that won them the Oscar for Best Short Animated Film. And so we've actually got the real Oscar on display.
Have you?
I've never seen a genuine Oscar before, but we've got this.
That's brilliant. And just going back to the kind of the original artwork element, I was lucky enough to go to an exhibition at, I think it was at Somerset House of the Beano, year before last, and I think that was the first time. Since then, I've seen several different things, but that was the first time I'd gone to see an exhibition of the original artwork of comics. And it blew my mind just seeing just the physicality of it and seeing the mark making and the changes and the editing and the kind of where things have been whited out and then gone back over, and you can see where where the changes have been made and the pencils and stuff. I absolutely love that stuff. I feel like if you feel even more connected to the creator and the person at the other end, when you see that kind of level of detail.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, because basically what you're getting is another story altogether. When you look at the page of comic artwork, obviously there's the story as presented to you by the writer and the artist, but you do see the story of that sheet of paper. Like you say, you can see where Tipp-Ex was used. You can see where a word balloon was changed. You can see little notes in the margin sometimes to the editor. All of which I find absolutely fascinating. You can also see, which gave me great heart when I was starting out as a cartoonist. You can see that, like I mentioned, Tipp-Ex can be copiously used. Sometimes you can see where artists have redrawn part of a picture and then glued it over the top. All of which I used to do, still do, when I first started out in the 80s. I used to just think that made me a rubbish artist. But no, a lot of the great and the good have worked that way too. So it's very encouraging to see. And also the sheer scale of it is usually comic art and original cartoon art, actually, is usually drawn way, way bigger than you see it printed on the page. So you do get that visual impact. And we have an original Beano front cover in full colour from 1969 on the wall right now. And it's like kind of A2 size. It is absolutely huge.
Yeah.
And just visually, it just knocks your socks off.
That is incredible. I mean, in fact, that's brought me on to something that I was going to talk to you about, because I know the museum's all about getting people into the act of drawing, creating cartoons, expressing themselves visually. And I know that through lots of conversations that I've had with librarians and with educators, both on the podcast and outside the podcast, that sometimes there's some real hesitations around, their own skill at drawing and the limitations that might have on them being able to introduce children to comics and creating comics. And I just wondered if you had any reflections through your experience on how that can kind of be overcome.
Well, yeah, hopefully a few. I mean, for starters, I think those kind of hesitations, as you put it, actually gives people a valuable insight as to how the kids might feel. If they themselves are unsure about whether or not they can draw, then that's how the kids are feeling. So yeah, I think that's got valuable insight. And
Yeah, definitely.
there's two things you can do around that. Number one, which has kept me in business for 30 odd years, is inviting someone like me to come and run a comics workshop for you. And we get 60 or 70 school visits here at the museum every year, where they come for an hour and a half in our classroom, and I teach them how to draw comics or how to draw particular types of characters. But also, it's important to remember, for adults as well as children, not all comics have to be like intricately detailed drawings. A lot of the most famous and wonderful comics and cartoons in the world have been really quite simply drawn. You could go right down as simple as something like the Mr. Men and the Little Misses. They're just really simple, colourful shapes with faces on them. And yet, world famous, extremely successful. So you could just take shapes, give them little arms and legs and faces. In fact, I did something very similar about a year ago with a group of very young people up in Ladbroke Grove in West London. And they were doing a project on maths, basically. And they asked me, they said, "Steve, could you come and do some comic workshops with our children, but on the theme of maths?" And my first thought was, oh dear,
That would be my first thought too.
Yeah, new territory for me. I could tie it in with like some subject they're doing at school, like, history or geography or a particular book or something. But I'd never been asked about maths before, so I thought, how on earth can I do this? So then I had the idea of turning numbers into characters. And so we drew cartoon 1s and 2s and 3s and 9s and 10s. And then we gave them little faces and little arms and legs. And then with the kids, I kind of brainstormed a really simple story where they each had their own number character. And the story was simply that they live in Numberland or something. And there's an evil big robot thing coming called the Number Cruncher, which was like a big sort of clanking metal thing that eats numbers. And so all these number characters, the mighty maths team as they became known, all had to multiply themselves together to make bigger numbers that were too big for the Number Cruncher. And so it was kind of like doing a bit of maths in comics. And it went, if I say so myself, it went very, very well. And they got a comic printed up of the stories that the children's did. So you can just use simple shapes, use numbers, use letters of the alphabet. There's an American cartoonist I really like called Ivan Brunetti.
Yes.
And he uses characters that are very, very simply drawn. They have circles for heads and usually triangles for bodies with little stick arms and legs. And yet he does a lot of very sophisticated comics just using that method. I love his stuff.
Yeah,
I haven't seen any of his stuff for quite a while, but I've got quite a bit of it back home. It's part of the collection that I did manage to retain, was to my girlfriend's annoyance.
And so you mentioned some of the kind of workshops that you've done, and I know that the Cartoon Museum also has online resources as well for people that are a little bit further away and maybe couldn't manage a school visit. So, but what sorts of things in general can schools access from the Cartoon Museum? It sounds like you're having quite a lot of visits and there's lots of things that schools could engage with.
If schools visit the Cartoon Museum website, and then head for the learning page, one of the first things you'll see on the way down the page is it will say free resources, click here. And that's where you will find a lot of the worksheets that I use in our workshops. How to draw a cartoon face, how to draw a cartoon figure. There's a couple of kind of comic strip story making games that they can print off where some of the pictures have been done to start the story and they have to finish it off themselves, including speech bubbles and all the rest of it. And then there's some caricature sheets, how to draw a funny picture of Beyonce or Boris Johnson, obviously.
Naturally.
Boris Johnson is just like a potato with hair. So there's a lot of worksheets that schools can download and come up with their own ideas of how to use them. They're not kind of prescribed in any way, but most schools, I think, could get a decent sort of 45-minute lesson out of some of the stuff that is there on our website and is completely free for them to use.
That's fantastic, because so much about those kind of resources is just knowing they're there and knowing that where you can go to access that kind of thing. So that's brilliant for people listening to podcasts to be able to find those. I had a little look through some of your workshops that are available for schools, and I was really drawn to This Is Us and the autism and SEND friendly workshop that you run. And I just thought that would be really interesting to just talk through a little bit. What does that involve and how have you developed that?
Okay, well, it was about 2 years or so back that our director, Joe Sullivan, began sort of suggesting that we target some of our work more at the SEND and autistic communities and families as well. And so we then worked with a couple of autism specialists who have worked in schools to develop two platforms, basically. So there's This Is Us is a class-based school project, and that is essentially allows kids of whatever level of ability to contribute to one giant cartoon picture. And so no matter, whether they can just scribble shapes on paper or whether they can perhaps sometimes draw, properly in inverted commas, everybody gets to take part in the picture. And it makes sense as a picture. It's essentially, we create, first of all, a big swirly-whirly patterns and shapes cartoon world, like a big universe picture. And they have a go, with my help, drawing a very simple cartoon version of themselves. I mean, as simple as just asking them, do you wear glasses? Here's how you draw glasses. What kind of hair have you got? Is it long? Do you have a ponytail? Have you got curly hair? Here's how you draw that. And then they have a go at drawing the rest of the body. And then we cut those out and we stick them on to the cartoon universe they've created. So it ends up being cartoon versions of them in their own cartoon world. And then that's all a giant sheet of paper that's stuck on the wall. And then we take it down, roll it up, and they can take it away for display at school. And obviously the teachers then have been watching what I've been doing. And they could probably have a go at running a similar session themselves, I would imagine. So there's that. And what we also have just for families with autistic and special needs kids is that once every 2 months, we have Relaxed Monday. Because on Monday, we're closed to the public, that is. Quite a few of us do come in and do work, but there's no members of the public floating about, which makes it perfect as a quieter environment for families with autistic children to bring them along. And then they can enjoy the galleries in peace and quiet. And we also have some other little simple, fun art activities they can take part in, should they so choose. And then there's, as ever, when the classroom's open to the public, there are piles of comics that people can just sit and read or doodle and draw for themselves. So it is very relaxed, and it also gives the parents a chance to, get out the house and chat with me and my colleague Amber. And that's been going very well. And we've been very pleased with the take-up. Last year, it won us the Museums and Heritage Award for community engagement.
That's fantastic.
I know, I was really surprised. I knew my boss had entered us for it. We thought we might get an honourable mention. So when we went along to this swanky dinner
Lovely.
in Trafalgar Square.
Very nice too.
And yeah, a very posh place. We sat down and we thought, well, at least we're getting a nice dinner out of it. And when they announced us as the winner, boy, oh boy, we were delighted and very surprised. That's
fantastic to have that recognition. And what feedback have you been getting from the children, young people that have been attending too, that they've been really enjoying being able to access all those kind of activities?
Yeah, it's been nothing but positive. We do have feedback forms that parents on Relaxed Monday fill out. And I have a very simple kind of like box ticking and drawing smiley faces kind of thing for the kids that come to do This Is Us. We've had no kind of negative feedback at all, just lots of encouragement and praise, which I'm delighted with, because encouragement and praise was not something I was getting when I was trying to do cartoons and comics at school, as I said earlier.
That's good. Yeah, you're reaping the benefits.
Yeah, it's called revenge, Lucy.
Revenge that contributes to society. So that's brilliant. Very nice. I know that the Cartoon Museum also is trying to encourage more nationally schools, organisations, young people to get involved, and you've got your annual award scheme running as well, the Alison Brown Young Comics Maestro Award. For any listeners new to that, can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and maybe how they can get involved, the kind of timings? Because I know lots of listeners run their own comics club. They might know of a young person that would be a great person to enter that. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, well, it's a fairly new competition that we launched 2 years ago. Alison Brown was a much-loved friend and colleague here at the Cartoon Museum. She ran the front desk and ran the shop. But sadly, she passed away from COVID in 2021. So lots of people wanted to, make a donation of some kind, to donate some money. And so we thought we'd set up the Young Comics Maestro Award, because Alison was always encouraging young cartoonists and comic creators. She would, if they had a little photocopied comic that they'd made themselves, she would sell it in the shop.
That's brilliant.
She was just a very friendly and lovely woman. So we thought this is the best way we could honour her memory. And so I think this year's will be opening in March. There's usually like a 2-month window. So it'll be like sometime in March. We'll announce it on our website, and it'll be open for entries until about the end of May. And then they'll be judging sometime around the end of June, I would imagine. That's how we've done it so far. And what we're looking for is, just for under 18s, up to 3 pages of original comic strip art. It doesn't have to tell a complete story. It can be part of a story that is projected to be much bigger, but it is enough for us to get a sense of a young person's abilities. Then, the winner will get, it's £200, and we have a display of their work and some runners-up here at the Cartoon Museum.
That's fantastic.
So it's, it'll get a lot of publicity, and, we hope it'll give people a bit of a leg up.
And what are you looking at in terms of selecting that winner? Are the judges looking for purely artistic merit? Or is it the story, the narrative writing, or is it the combination of both?
Yeah, it's only the combination of both, because, as we all know, comics are a combination of words and pictures most of the time. I have seen silent comics. I've never attempted one myself. I think they'd be very, very difficult to do. If it's written and drawn to a decent standard, that's great. Other things that are kind of key and crucial is originality. The number of times we've had entries where it's just a thinly veiled version of Wolverine. Except, this guy's got 6 claws, not 3. Then, you think, well, no, sorry.
Yeah.
And we are looking to try and encourage people to attempt something fresh.
A bit different.
And something new.
Yeah. That's great.
Rather than just aping their favourite style. That's perfectly natural, because, that's what I did when I was starting out as a cartoonist. I was kind of always had in mind that I wanted to draw like insert name of favourite current artist here. And before long, I realised if I went down that route, I would only ever be the poor man's version of. And so that's when I set about, just developing my own style. And so that's what we encourage entrants to do for the Young Comics Maestro Award. And we do get a fairly good standard of entries. It's always interesting to see what people send.
If teachers, librarians, anyone listening that was running a comics club thinks of somebody that might be interested, they can always give them a nudge, can't they, to enter or create a piece of work especially for it.
Of course, yeah, and schools and libraries can enter work on children's behalf. That's no problem. Brilliant. We're currently running the Young Cartoonists Award, which is a separate thing for just people who do single panel gags. And quite a few of those entries have come in from school teachers saying this is the work of, Jemima Smith, age 9. And yeah, that's absolutely fine.
I wonder if you could kind of, just drawing on all of the things that you've learnt through your experience of working with children and young people in comics over the years, we can pick out some key takeaways that might be useful for teachers and educators listening to just influence and inspire them to try something different or a new approach in their practice.
Okay, well, the first thing I would recommend is remember that some children might have never read a comic. I'm surprised how often that actually crops up. Especially in these days of digital tablets and all the other cornucopia of visual delights that children are growing up with. Yeah, it doesn't happen terribly often, but often enough for me to have noticed that there will sometimes be 2 or 3 kids at the start. When I say hands up who likes comics, there might well be 2 or 3 kids that don't put their hand up, and they might say, I've never read a comic. Luckily, we've got lots of Beanos on the tables in our classroom, so I'll just say, well, there's a comic, have a bit of a read. And it just acclimatises them to what it is. So make sure that kids know what comics are. And if possible, bring some in. You can borrow age-suitable graphic novels from your local library if you're lucky enough to still have one. Or, you might know somebody that could bring some stuff in for them. And
quite often libraries have access to them online as well. I know quite a lot of libraries you can access Beano each week online for free, which is a good way because you can put it on the whiteboards then and everyone can see it really big in the classroom as well, which is useful.
Yeah, that actually, you're right, because nowadays a lot of classrooms have those gigantic kind of projector screens. So, that would be a perfect way of showing comics to the entire classroom. Maybe get them to read out the word balloons as though they were reading a play. Choose who's going to be Dennis, who's going to be Minnie the Minx, who's going to be Dad, and then they read out those bubbles for that page.
Yeah, that'd be
That'd
brilliant.
be a good way of getting them into reading, as well as enjoying the pictures. I did something similar with that years back in a school, and it worked really well. Then the other thing I would say about that is get the kids excited from the start. I will show them a comic, and I'll show them comics that I've done with other children, and they'll be like, oh, wow, and that gets them excited. So then when they sit down to try and write and draw their own stuff, they've got a clear goal in mind. They want their stuff to be as good as the stuff they've just been shown. And despite this age of, everything being on the internet, there is still a thrill I see on, young people's faces when stuff gets printed up as actual physical comics, just like something they would see in a shop. That really validates their work for them. These days, you can print things yourselves. Like if you've got a decent printer at school, you could make little comic booklets, and staple them together yourself. Or actual printing costs have come down massively. These days, I've been getting comics printed for school groups I'm working with. And you can get like a sort of a 32-page comic or a 48-page comic in colour on decent paper. And you can get maybe 400 copies of that comic printed for about £300. It's insanely cheap.
Yeah, I agree. There's something so special about that physical endpoint and, being able to hold something in your hands that you've created. And you can put them in the library, you can send a copy home, you can have some copies in the school library, even maybe the public library down the road if you've got one, as you say. And then that moment of pride, it's not just one moment of pride, is it? It's every time you see it in somebody reading it in the library, every time, you come across it at home, it's constantly reinforcing. You can do this. You can make something. And it's
it's never been easier, I think, in history for people to actually get their work out. And of course, I'm not discounting the power of the internet, because if you've got all the pages of your comic as a PDF, well, you can email that to friends and relatives all around the world.
Yeah.
So you could always have an online presence with your work as well. On the learning page in the Cartoon Museum website, you scroll right down to the bottom, you can see a couple of comics that I did a couple of years ago now with groups. We did 2 comics called Life Under Lockdown, where I got the young people in different groups from around Westminster to do simple comic strips showing us what they did during the times of lockdown in 2020 and 2021. And it was really interesting to see what it was, that they put down about what they did. There was a great deal of flicks involved and computer games, but there was also some kids who, one kid learned to play the guitar and things like that. It was very, very, very interesting stuff. So those comics, they're available to download as PDFs on the Cartoon Museum learning page of the website. And I'm currently working on 2 others with groups I worked with last year. I'm just finishing those off. I worked with a group of young refugees where we did a comic called Living in Britain, with their sort of thoughts and feelings about what it's like to live in Britain, having come from another country. And I'm just finishing off a comic booklet that I did with only 2 schools, but it was over 80 children, all about climate change, their fears and worries and concerns about what's been going on. In the news, just yesterday, it was all the flooding that's spread across Britain. So, that's addressed in this comic about, people think of global warming as just meaning things get hotter. But when the ocean, as we know, when the ocean gets hotter, it evaporates more into the atmosphere, which creates more rain clouds. And that's what's creating all the problems that we're seeing around the world now. So the kids did their cartoon responses to that with suggestions as to what they think they could do to kind of ameliorate the oncoming climate crisis. Putting it down in a comic book means that will be available for other children to read, hopefully in a way that's more understandable than trying to read about it in a newspaper.
Definitely.
And hopefully not as perhaps worrying or frightening as it might appear when you see people getting flooded out on the news. So hopefully it'll get them thinking. So I'm hoping that we'll get those comics printed very soon, and then they will be available to download on the website as well.
To end the podcast, I usually ask guests to recommend us a book or comic, or could be a book about comics, to add to our to-be-read piles. What would you recommend that we checked out? Okay,
well, I just very recently finished reading a graphic novel I've been trying to track down for over a year, which I'd heard about that it was very good. I'd seen a couple of snippets online, and it is one of the best graphic novels I have ever experienced.
Wow, that's quite an intro.
It is just, yeah, I mean, it is a clever book that really toys with the medium of comics and with the way that we read comics, not in any kind of wacky William Burroughs type way. It does make sense, but when you get to the end of this book, that I'll tell you it in a minute, when you get to the end of this book, you immediately turn back to the front page and begin reading it again, because all of these little things, that slightly odd things that were mentioned or said as you were reading it, suddenly they all make a really kind of grim and interesting kind of sense. So the book is called Why Don't You Love Me by a man called Paul B. Rainey. It's kind of a landscape format book because it was originally a webcomic, but it's been collected as a lovely kind of hardback book. And it's, a right riveting read. It's about a young couple who don't get on very well, and they've got like a couple of kids who drive them mad. It's not knockabout comedy. It's not a bunch of one-liners. It's really kind of like, it's kind of funny because it's true. And honestly, in terms of comic book sophistication, for me, that's up there with Watchmen in terms of the way it plays around with the actual nature and form of what a comic can do.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that recommendation. I've already had that kind of, I wouldn't say it was at the top of my to be read list, but I was aware of it as something that I definitely wanted to check out. So you've definitely bumped it up the list. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for coming onto the podcast and for telling us all about both your own story and getting us up to speed on everything that's going on at the Cartoon Museum. Is there anything exciting, any new things happening this year that you'd like to tell us about for later on? You've got the Wallace and Gromit exhibition at the moment. Do you know what comes after that yet?
What comes after that is a closely guarded secret at the moment.
Okay. Well, let me know once it's shareable, and I'll let all listeners know on one of my kind of outros where I round up different bits and bobs, and I'll let people know. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and for sharing all your knowledge. It's been brilliant to chat to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Lucy. Makes me feel important, and I need that.
You are important. There we have it. So great to hear from Steve about all the things going on in the Cartoon Museum. This episode took a little bit of a while to come out, and in the meantime we have missed the annual conference at the Cartoon Museum, which is for comics creators, anyone interested in building that into a profession or developing their practice in comics creation. So do look out for that in future years. That's every February. I can see on their website they've got a model making workshop with Aardman Studios this month, and also a webinar about the clangers, which is very exciting to me. So lots of content on there always being refreshed on their website. You don't have to be London based to be able to access some of the brilliant resources and offers that they've got on. So do check them out. There's a really interesting range of things available from the Cartoon Museum. What have I been reading lately? I've been reading It's Lonely at the Centre of the Earth by Zoe Thorogood, another one of the books that I got for Christmas. It is amazing. It's so good. I'm actually having to hold myself back. I don't want to rush through it because there's so many different things in there to look at and explore and think through that I think it needs a good slow read, but it's so good it makes you want to rush it. So yeah, I'm trying to hold back. I haven't quite finished yet, but yeah, very good. I really recommend that. The way that different themes and ideas are presented using different styles of artwork, it's just brilliant. I would definitely recommend that for an adult reader. That's it for me this week. It's been a bit of a busy week, so the episodes are a bit chaotic. I've had one child's birthday last weekend, another child's birthday next weekend, so I do not think there's going to be an episode of Comic Boom next week. We will probably have a skipper week. I am doing some interviews though, and I have the next 2 episodes will be ready to go out in the 2 weeks following that, so keep an eye out for those. Don't forget about us in the week off. As usual, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do that by logging on to ko-fi.com/LucySB. That's ko-fi.com/LucySB. Lots of small press comics creators sell their comics on ko-fi.com, so it's always worth having a little bit of a browse. You might find something you have not seen before on there and be able to buy directly from small press comics creators. So it's an interesting alternative to Etsy, which a lot of makers are moving away from now. So if you do want to buy direct from comics creators, do have a little browse. You can also leave a review on whichever platform you listen on, and you can share with your colleagues and networks. That is the most valuable thing you can do. It's always really appreciated. We love to grow our listener base. And you can also follow me on Twitter /X on @Lucy_Braidley, or follow the podcast on @comic_boom_podcast. So you can follow, keep up to date with what episodes are coming out, and get in touch with the podcast through all of those platforms. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Braidley, producer and host of Comic Boom.